This woman was kicked off the wagon train, but her journey to the farmer's heart had just begun. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The wind pressed along the dry earth and steady, cutting waves, flattening what little grass was left along the narrow trail east of Fort Laramie. It was late autumn. The wagon train had crested the hill hours ago, the last of its wooden wheels carving grooves into the dirt before vanishing toward the Bighorn foothills. No one looked back. No one slowed. Iris Cowan stood alone by the side of the trail, her feet aching in boots that had long since lost their shape. One arm holding the strap of a cloth sack, the other gripping a cracked canteen. Her lips were split from windburn, and her hands, though she kept them still, trembled from more than just cold. The sun was behind her now, dropping fast. The air had a bite to it. She had maybe an hour of light left. She hadn't begged them to let her stay. There hadn't been any use. Braxton had already made up his mind. He'd used the same kind of certainty he brought to ordering the others to gather wood or yoke the oxen. Flat, final, without room for appeal. "You bring misfortune," he'd said that morning, standing just outside the circle of wagons, his boots planted like it was sacred ground. "There's been too many accidents since you joined. I've got mothers praying and men watching you out the corners of their eyes." She remembered trying to hold his gaze, but his face remained closed, unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain what misfortune meant. It could have been anything: the old woman who fell from the wagon bed and broke her hip, the runaway horse that got tangled in a cook fire line, the baby that never woke after a cold night. Or it could have been nothing. She hadn't asked. She just picked up her sack and stepped down without a word. No one helped her. No one stopped her. She'd known that would happen too. She wasn't a widow, not officially. Her husband had disappeared 2 years earlier, taken off for California, and never ridden back. They'd only been married 9 months. She had no papers proving his death, no money to follow, and nowhere else to go. So when a wagon train was forming up that summer and they needed people who could cook, mend, clean, she'd lied and said she was a widow. People trusted widows more than they did women left behind. Now she was 31, alone, and off the trail with nowhere marked on the map. Her plan had never been much more than get west. Somewhere greener. Somewhere she could stop explaining why she was still standing when the man who promised to love her vanished without even taking his boots. She sat down on a rock just off the trail. Her legs were tired. Her body ached in ways she didn't like thinking about. Ribs sore from sleeping upright too many nights, an old stomach not that twisted when she got too hungry. The canteen had maybe 3 swallows left, and her sack held a change of clothes, a pair of broken sewing shears, a bar of soap, and a crust of bread so hard it might as well have been a stone. She didn't know whether to walk east toward the fort or west and try to catch up, not that she ever could. Either direction meant open plains and night falling fast. Her hands tightened around the canteen again, and she felt something low in her chest, something dry and tight. Not panic, exactly, but a rising pressure. She hated the feeling. It had followed her since she was a girl. She had never figured out how to stop it. That's when she heard the wheels. She turned her head slow. A single cart, mule-drawn, came up over the ridge. No shouting, no snapping of reins. Just the dull sound of wooden wheels against dry ground and the plodding steps of a single animal that looked like it had no intention of rushing. The man driving the cart wore a brown coat heavy with dust and sweat along the seams. His hat was low over his face, shadowing his eyes, and there was something in the way he sat, upright, hands steady on the reins, not hunched, not slouched, that told her he wasn't a man looking to talk. He didn't stop at first. The mule kept moving down the slope, past the flattened grass and wheel ruts. But the man's head turned. His eyes caught hers. And in that brief moment, Iris felt a familiar flood of unease, the kind that came before someone said something cruel, or turned away, or stared too long without blinking. But he didn't do any of that. Instead, he slowed the mule, drew the cart to a stop about 10 yards past her, climbed down without a word, and walked around the back. He pulled the flap on the cart open. Inside were sacks of flour, a bundle of tools, a rolled canvas, and a small crate of dried beans. Nothing valuable. Nothing fancy, He looked at her again, then gave a short nod, once, and stepped back. It wasn't an invitation, not in the way men use the word. He didn't ask her name, didn't say a word about where she was headed or why she'd been left behind. He didn't seem surprised or curious or angry. He just gestured with one hand calm and open and climbed back onto the bench. Iris stood. Her knees were stiff. Her heart was thudding harder than it needed to. She didn't want to trust him, but she didn't have better options. She hesitated, not because she feared him, but because taking his offer meant giving up whatever pride she had left. Then again, pride didn't count for much out here. She walked to the back of the cart, hoisted herself in, and sat cross-legged beside a bundle of rope. The mule moved forward as soon as he tapped the reins. They didn't speak as the cart rocked down the rutted path. Time passed. She watched the land flatten into dark shapes, her fingers brushing the canvas edge to steady herself. The man up front didn't look back. His posture never changed, just a steady gaze ahead, like he knew exactly where he was going and had no need for questions. Iris studied him in the fading light. Mid-30s maybe, broad-backed, sun-worn. The kind of man who had worked his own land for years without ever saying much about it. There was something hard about him, but not mean. She didn't know what his story was, but she could guess a few things. He didn't have a wife, didn't care for strangers, didn't like unnecessary talk. And yet, here she was in his cart. When they reached his land, it was dark. A split-rail fence marked the boundary, slumped and broken in places. Beyond it, a cabin stood at the edge of a field half overgrown, with two small sheds on either side, one of them burned out and black along the roofline. He drove the mule around back, unhitched it in practiced silence, led it to the stable, and returned without glancing toward her. The front door of the cabin creaked when he opened it. He didn't say anything. He left it open. She stepped down. The ground was cold under her boots. The inside smelled like dry wood, ash, and clean soil, not perfume or food or sweat. The fire inside was low, more embers than flame, but the warmth reached her hands as she stood just past the threshold. He lit a lantern and hung it from a peg. The room was simple, a table with one chair, a cot in the corner, shelves with tins and folded cloth, a stone hearth with wood stacked to the side. It wasn't poor. It was lived in. He poured a cup of water from a basin and set it on the floor near the fire. Then he sat in the chair without saying anything else. She didn't thank him. He didn't wait for it. She sat cross-legged by the fire, arms around her knees, her bag resting beside her like it was the only thing she owned, because it was. For a long while, neither of them moved. Then he leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, and she stayed where she was. The fire burned low into the night. Its glow spread in slow, irregular pulses along the worn wooden floor, catching the faint outlines of the shelves, the table, and the soles of Levi Grebber's boots. He hadn't moved in a while, not since settling back in that chair with his arms folded and eyes closed, though he hadn't been asleep either, just still in the way of someone used to silence and not bothered by it. Iris didn't sleep for a long time. She sat on the floor, back to the wall, one hand resting on her sack, not holding it, but near enough to feel the worn cloth under her fingers. Her eyes drifted across the room, checking each corner the way she always did in new places. It wasn't fear exactly, not anymore, just habit. Look where the exits are, note what's sharp, what's heavy, what's yours. Nothing in the cabin felt threatening, but she didn't let that loosen anything in her. Not yet. She studied Levi's face in the firelight. Hard angles, wind-marked skin, mouth set in a line that hadn't relaxed all evening. He hadn't spoken a single word. Not on the trail, not at the door, not inside. And yet he hadn't turned her away, hadn't asked questions, hadn't looked at her like she owed him something for the space she took up on his floor. That quiet, steady restraint stayed with her. It calmed part of her nerves and agitated another. She didn't know what he expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe just her presence by the fire was enough. But people always wanted something eventually. She shifted a little, trying not to make noise, and pulled her coat tighter across her lap. The cold came in under the door in thin waves. She'd slept in worse places. Barn lofts. A rotting boat once, when the river dried too low to float it. One night, in a church storeroom with a broken window that let in every wind. Compared to those, this was something close to safe. Still, she didn't close her eyes. Across the room, Levi opened his. He didn't look at her, just reached slowly for a small tin box on the table, opened it, and pulled out 2 pieces of jerky. He stood, crossed to the hearth, and set one piece down on the floor near her without a word, then went back to his chair and ate the other himself. She stared at the food. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't asked for anything, but he'd noticed anyway. She picked it up, nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, then ate it slowly, chewing each bite until it softened enough to swallow without hurting. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and she hadn't had honest in her hands in a long time. Sometime before dawn, sleep took her. Not deeply, not comfortably, but enough. She woke when the light in the room changed. Gray at first, creeping in through a cracked shutter. Then stronger, colder. Her body was stiff, neck sore from how she'd curled against the wall. She sat up, ran a hand through her hair, and took in the space again with clearer eyes. The coals on the hearth had gone dull red. The cup of water from the night before was half full. Levi was gone. Panic rose for half a breath, a rush of old instinct. Left again, stranded again, but she quieted it. His coat was still there, hanging on the back of the chair. The mule was outside, tethered to a split post. Smoke rose from behind the cabin. She stood, slow and cautious, then walked to the window. He was splitting wood in the yard. Shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. Movement steady and efficient, not hurried. There were no signs of second person. No woman's touch in the place. No child belongings. The cabin was lived in, but only by him. She turned from the window and moved to the small wash basin near the hearth. She didn't ask if she could use it. Just did. She scrubbed her face with the cold water and wiped it dry with the hem of her sleeve. Then she took out her only other dress from the sack, laid it across the chair, and began sewing the seam where it had split last week. The motion familiar, quiet, something she could do without looking. The door opened with a low creak. Levi stepped in, a bundle of chopped kindling in his arms. His eyes flicked once to her, sewing, calm, alert, then to the fire. He walked over, crouched, and began rebuilding it without speaking. She didn't interrupt. When the flame caught, he stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, then finally spoke, just one word, low and clear. Hungry. She paused, nodded. He turned, pulled down a pan from the wall, and started preparing cornmeal from a sack tucked under the shelf. No ceremony, no questions. Iris watched. She didn't feel grateful, not in the sense people used it like a chain, but she recognized the act for what it was, a man choosing to make room for another person, one task at a time. When he handed her a plate, she took it with both hands, sat by the table, the only chair still occupied by his coat, and ate on the floor, knees drawn up, her back straight. He didn't offer the chair. She didn't ask. When they finished, he gathered the dishes, washed them without instruction, then turned to her with a nod. I have chores. That was all he said. Then he went outside again. She stared at the closed door. He hadn't asked her to leave. She folded her dress, tucked it back in the sack, then stood, pulled on her coat, and followed him out. Not with a question, not with a plan, but because it felt right to move in the direction of someone who hadn't sent her away. Outside, he was fixing a broken rail along the fence. She walked past him, picked up a loose post from the pile, and set it upright in the frozen soil. They didn't speak, but she stayed. And that, in both their minds, was enough for now. By the third day, the rhythm of shared silence had settled into something that neither of them needed to explain. Levi worked the land as if no one else were there. Iris watched him carefully, learning the timing of his movements, the shape of his habits, the quiet logic that governed how and when he chose to act. He didn't offer tasks, but he didn't refuse help when she stepped forward either. That morning, she rose before he did and swept out the hearth corner where the ashes had gathered thick, and when he walked in from checking the mule's leg, still tender from an old strain, he didn't say anything about the swept floor. But he left his boots by the door that night, and she noticed that meant something. They patched a section of fencing before noon. She held the posts upright while he set the nails with short, clean swings of the hammer. He didn't explain why certain ones mattered more than others. She didn't ask. The land around the cabin stretched wide and exposed. No trees, no high hills to break the wind, and any opening in that fence felt like leaving the door unlocked, not for people, but for the cold, the wild, and whatever else didn't knock. As the sun pulled higher, Iris paused to rest her hands, fingers scraped from rough timber, and watched the way he stood when he finished a row. Not proud, not weary, just done. There was a steadiness in him that didn't come from strength alone. It was the kind of endurance a man earns after grief strips away anything softer and leaves behind only what must keep going. She didn't know the shape of his grief yet, but she knew it lived in his silence. That afternoon, he walked out to the shed she hadn't entered yet, the one with the scorched rafters and half-collapsed roof. He didn't gesture for her to follow, but she did, trailing a few steps behind until he stepped aside and let her see what was inside. The shed had burned months ago. That much was clear. Char remained on the inside walls, and the roof sagged under a layer of soot and weather. Tools were still hanging along one wall, blackened handles, a spade warped from heat, a hammer with its head buried in ash. She stepped in carefully, her boot brushing aside a brittle horseshoe near the door. "What happened?" she asked. It was the first question she'd asked since arriving. He didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, knelt beside a crate buried under singed burlap, and pulled free a rusted canister. "Storm," he said, finally. Lightning hit the far tree line. Wind carried it this way. She waited. My wife was inside when it started, trying to close the shutters. Iris swallowed and said nothing. He stood again, looked at the far wall. She didn't come out. A pause. It was fast. There was no break in his voice. No apology for saying it. No attempt to soften the edge. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. That was all he intended to say about it. And she understood that was all he could say. They spent the next few hours clearing out what could still be used. Old nails, some fencing wire, a cracked water bucket that might hold feed. She worked without speaking, her hands red and raw by sundown. They didn't eat a hot supper that night. Just dried beans soaked in cold water, split between them, eaten on the porch step where the wind ran slower against the wall. She watched the horizon fade. The plains stretched so far out that distance felt meaningless, like they weren't really in Wyoming anymore, just in a place between one kind of life and the next. As night fell, she asked her second question. "Why did you stop for me?" He didn't turn. "Because you didn't cry." That was all. Later, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, Iris sat at the table. He brought in a second chair that morning without saying anything. She didn't sit in it right away. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what that chair meant. It meant space had been made deliberately, and she didn't want to take it without understanding what was expected in return. But by the third night, after clearing ash from the fire and folding the used cloths near the basin, she sat in it. No ceremony, no questions. She sat, and he looked once from his place near the stove, gave the faintest nod, then turned back to the pot he was filling. The space between them hadn't closed. Not fully, but something in it had changed. She still didn't know if he meant for her to stay past winter. He hadn't said, and she didn't know if she could trust him not to change his mind. But for the first time in months, maybe longer, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel pitted. She didn't feel like she was surviving in someone else's shadow. She just felt there. And that night, when she lay down on the cot across the room, her cot now, though neither of them had said it, she fell asleep without checking the door. The wind shifted with the season. By the end of the fourth week, the mornings came colder, sharper through the cracks beneath the cabin door. Frost collected along the window edges and lingered well past sunrise. Levi had already begun checking the firewood stack each morning with a quiet urgency, counting how much they had left and how much they still needed before the first snowfall locked the ground solid. He didn't say they were behind, but she could tell. The way he looked at the empty stretch of field where trees once stood before a burn stripped the land bare, it told her everything. Iris had been cutting kindling in the back lot since dawn. Her palms were raw again. The hatchet felt heavier than it had a week ago. Still, she didn't stop. Not when her shoulders ached, not when the chill crept up her sleeves. She had done harder things. But here, it mattered more. No one had told her to do it. No one checked her work. But when Levi passed by, hauling two split logs from the stump pile, and gave a small, silent nod, she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't trusted in a long time. The feeling of being useful in a place that wasn't using her. They barely spoke, but the silence had shape now. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the space where effort lived, where routine settled in without being named. That morning, he handed her a pair of worn gloves without a word. She took them, nodded once, and kept splitting. Later, while hauling firewood to the lean-to, she asked her third question. How long's it been? Since the fire? He paused, resting the edge of a log against his hip. 15 months. She waited. He didn't say more. She didn't press. Instead, she asked something else quieter. Did you build this place with her? He looked at the cabin, his eyes following the line of the roof, the way the corner joints sat, just a little crooked. We started it together. She helped frame the south wall. A short pause. I finished it alone. There was no sorrow in the way he said it, just the truth, plain and even. They carried the last of the logs in silence. Inside, the heat from a midday fire hadn't reached the corners yet. Iris lit the second lantern, the one she had found tucked in a storage crate 2 weeks earlier. Levi didn't question her for using it. They both moved quieter indoors, as if something about the walls made sound feel heavier. At the table, she rolled out a section of rough fabric from her bag, the one she'd kept packed since the wagon train. From it, she cut squares of material, repurposing a burned pillowcase and her second dress's torn hem. She didn't ask permission. She simply sewed, threading small, even stitches into what would become thick patches for the inside of Levi's coat lining. He noticed. He didn't stop her. Instead, after the fifth patch was laid flat, he spoke without looking up from the fire. You from Missouri? She looked up, startled. His first question. Yes. What part? South of Jefferson City. Farm country. He gave a small nod. I was born near Rolla. That was all he said. That was all she needed. The moment didn't stretch into anything more. But something had shifted. By evening, the clouds had started stacking low over the plains. The wind was slow, but cold enough to bite if you stood out too long. Levi brought the mule into the stable earlier than usual. She followed to help with the straw. While there, she brushed the animal's flank, moving carefully along its side. The mule's rear legs still bore a faint limp, but it no longer resisted touch. That was her doing. She had tended it each morning without being asked, cleaning the hoof, checking the joint, soaking the wrap cloth when needed. Levi had seen it, and though he never said thank you, he stopped checking her work after the first week. Inside the stable, the quiet was thicker, warmer. She leaned her head gently against the mule's side and closed her eyes. A moment later, she heard his boots stop just behind her. She was going to keep these, he said. She turned. My wife. That's what the old shed was for. We just got the frames built. She wanted to start in spring. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't looking for comfort. Iris nodded, slow. You ever think of trying again? He shrugged, barely noticeable. Not without her. She said nothing. He looked at her then, steady. Not with expectation. Not with hope. Just the clear, simple awareness of someone who saw her not as a stranger, but as a person still standing. I never planned to stop for anyone. I never planned to end up here. He nodded once. That was enough. That night, when they returned inside, she filled the basin with warm water and handed it to him without a word. He washed his hands, face, and left the basin near the hearth. She dried it out with a cloth. Every movement between them felt like a sentence they didn't need to speak. They ate together, not beside each other, but near enough that the warmth of the fire reached them both. She sat in the second chair. He didn't glance at it this time, and when he got up to lock the door that night, he didn't check to see if she was staying. She already was. The snow came without warning. It wasn't a storm, not yet, just a slow, quiet fall that began before dawn and settled over the earth in thin, deliberate layers. When Iris opened the door that morning to fetch more firewood, the sky was a pale, milky white, and the ground had turned soft with the weight of the season's first snow. She stood still for a moment, watching how the flakes moved sideways across the yard, how the fences were already wearing a thin coat of white like the land had forgotten it was still autumn. Inside, Levi finished lacing his boots. He glanced at her, didn't speak, but she stepped back and closed the door without needing to be asked. The cold had turned sharp overnight. He had already stacked the firewood by the hearth the night before, more than usual, like he'd sensed something in the air. Now, as he stood by the stove preparing the morning oats, she looked at him differently. Not in suspicion, not in awe, but with a sharper understanding. This was how he moved through life. Prepare, don't explain, let your actions speak. She sat at the table and stirred the basin of water, using the last of the clean cloths to scrub their eating tin. Her hands ached from the cold, and the cracked skin along her knuckles had begun to sting. Still, she didn't mention it. Instead, she asked another question, one that had been building quietly between them. You ever go back? To town? Levi finished stirring the oats and set the spoon down slow. No. Why? He didn't answer right away. Just poured 2 servings into the tin bowls, handed her one, and sat opposite her. Nothing I need there, he said finally. Nothing I left behind. Iris watched him carefully. What about family? None close. Not anymore. She let the pause settle. I never had any, she said, her voice steady but low. Parents died when I was 17. Farm was taken by the bank before winter. After that I moved through towns. Found work when I could. Sometimes stayed. Most times didn't. He didn't ask for details. She didn't offer them. I married a man who said he'd send for me, she added. He didn't, so I stopped waiting. That was the closest either of them had come to admitting the whole of it. The weight they carried before the trail, before the fire, before the quiet days spent side by side in a place neither had planned to end up. That day they stayed indoors. The snow thickened by noon, steady and dry. Levi lit the second lamp early. They spent the morning repairing the loose leg on the table, with her holding the frame while he adjusted the braces beneath. The work wasn't urgent, but it gave shape to the hours, and neither of them had much use for idleness. Later, Iris went through the crate of old clothes beside the hearth, the ones Levi hadn't touched since she arrived. She pulled out a wool coat, stiff at the collar, too large for her, but whole. Inside one pocket was a folded letter, stained with water at the corners. She didn't open it. She tucked it back in and folded the coat neatly, placing it aside with care. Levi entered the room just then and stopped at the doorway. He saw the coat, saw her looking at it. It was hers, he said. Iris didn't apologize. She didn't explain. I didn't read it. He nodded once. You can keep it. The coat. She shook her head. It's not mine. She'd want it used. The subject ended there. That evening, Levi brought in the dried beans she'd been soaking near the hearth and handed her a tin of salt and a handful of dried wild onion. It was the first time he'd given her something to cook without asking. She said nothing, just set the pot on the hook above the fire and stirred the mixture slowly, watching the steam rise. They ate together in silence, each listening to the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Afterward, he brought out a small tin box from the shelf. Inside were tools she hadn't seen yet. A brass compass, a folding knife, a set of worn playing cards wrapped in twine. These were my brother's, he said. He died during the war. Never made a home. She didn't reach for the box. She didn't ask questions. Levi picked up the cards, unwrapped the twine, and laid them out slowly on the table. You ever play poker? I know the rules, she said. He handed her 5 cards, dealt his own, and the game began. They played 2 hands, neither speaking. She won the first. He won the second. When the cards were gathered again, she looked at him across the small table, the firelight catching the lines beneath his eyes. Are you going to ask me to leave once the storm passes? She asked quietly. Levi leaned back in his chair, folded the cards slow, and tied the twine back around them. No. No hesitation. No elaboration. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Later, as she folded a blanket near the fire and set it over the cot, she glanced back toward the table. Levi was still sitting, eyes on the coals, the tin box closed, hands resting loose in his lap. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She turned down the lamp, sat in the chair, and for the first time, she didn't wonder what would come the next morning. She knew. The snow didn't stop. By the 5th day, the yard had turned to white and stayed that way. The fence line was no longer visible past 20 paces. The trees in the distant ridge, once a thin black line against the western sky, had disappeared entirely. Everything was still. Even the mules stood quieter in the stable, as if it, too, understood that the world had shrunk down to the cabin, the woodpile, the breath between two people living beneath one roof. Iris moved through the days with quiet precision. In the mornings, she boiled water for washing, then sorted through the pantry shelves, counting jars, marking what they had left: dried beans, cracked corn, lard, a small sack of flour tied shut with twine. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew they'd be stretching every meal if the storm lasted much longer. Levi said even less than usual, but he watched more. Not in a suspicious way. More like he was memorizing each gesture, each decision she made without being asked. When she boiled scraps of bone into broth, or mended his torn work shirt without pointing it out, or added one of her own knit cloths to the crate by the fire, he saw it. He noticed. That morning, he caught her placing half of her own dried apples into the supply crate, the ones she'd taken off the wagon train, still wrapped in a cloth tucked deep in her sack. He didn't ask why. She didn't offer an explanation. But when supper came, he gave her the bigger portion. Later that evening, as the wind howled around the corners of the cabin and whistled through the narrow cracks between boards, she asked the question that had lingered longest between them. Was she buried out there? Levi didn't move at first. He sat with his back to the fire, arms resting on his knees, eyes on the floor. No. His voice was low. Not pain, not angry. Just honest. She's buried 3 miles south, by the river, near the old willows. He stood, crossed to the shelf, pulled down a folded wool blanket, and handed it to her. She wanted to be near water. Iris held the blanket, thumb brushing the frayed edge. Do you go? Every week. Unless the weather says no. You go alone? He looked at her. I always did. There was a beat of silence between them. Not sharp, not uncomfortable. Just still. Would you want company next time? He didn't answer immediately, but he didn't say no. That night, the wind picked up. The fire popped loud, and the roof groaned once under the weight of fresh snow. Levi checked the door bolts twice. Iris placed a bucket under the leak in the corner that had opened with the freeze. Neither of them spoke of it, but both moved with the understanding that winter wasn't done yet, and they'd likely be inside for days more before the sun came again. To pass time, Iris unwrapped her needle kit. She pulled out a strip of pale cloth and began stitching a simple line. Nothing decorative, just a steady row of thread meant to hold. Levi watched her hands, then surprised her. My wife used to do that at the window. Sit there and sew while I worked. She didn't look up. What was her name? Alma. Iris nodded once. That's a strong name. He didn't reply, but his face changed, just slightly, as if he'd forgotten how it felt to hear it said out loud. They didn't talk about Alma after that. Not directly, but the name remained in the room like a presence. Not unwelcome, not heavy, just there, acknowledged, and then left alone. The next morning, Iris stepped outside to check the snow depth and found her old boots soaked through by the drift piled against the door. She tried to shake the ice off, but the leather was cracking. When she stepped back inside, Levi noticed the limp in her gait. He didn't speak, just left the cabin briefly and returned with an old pair of boots, too wide but dry, and set them by the hearth. She looked at them. These were yours. He nodded. You sure? They're warmer than yours. She slipped them on. They didn't fit perfectly, but they held. Later that afternoon, while reorganizing a top shelf she hadn't touched before, Iris came across a folded wool garment. It was small, child-sized, likely old. She didn't unfold it. She stood with it in her hands for a moment, then quietly placed it back where it had been. She didn't ask. He didn't bring it up. But when he saw where she'd been standing and saw her eyes, he gave a short, near-invisible nod. She understood. There had been more loss than just Alma. That night, as they sat in the dim of the room, sharing the last of the bean stew, Levi spoke once more, almost in passing. I didn't know if I'd speak again after that first year. Iris met his eyes across the table. And now, I don't mind it. That was all. The wind calmed that evening. The snow softened into quiet, and the space between them felt closer, not from words, but from all the things that had finally been left behind. The snow let up on the morning of the seventh day. The wind quieted. The sun broke through in strips, casting faint light across the iced-over yard. The world outside hadn't thawed. Not yet, but the storm had passed. The air still bit at the skin, but the silence beyond the door was no longer threatening, just cold and still and waiting. Levi stepped outside first. Iris followed, boots crunching through the frozen crust. The snow reached past her knees in places. She walked slow, measuring each step, her breath hanging in clouds. Levi moved ahead without speaking, a shovel in hand, clearing a narrow path from the cabin to the stable. The mule greeted them with a soft snort, its nose steaming, its feed nearly gone. She filled the trough with what was left of the oats, while Levi worked at breaking the ice that had crusted along the back wall. It was the first time in nearly a week she'd seen the sky, open and pale blue. Thin clouds stretched high. The light hit the valley in uneven patches, but it was real, and it changed the air around her. Back inside, she unwrapped her hands, flexed her sore fingers, and stoked the fire. Levi returned a few minutes later with a wrapped bundle. He placed it on the table and opened it. A small stack of dried meat, a jar of pickled roots, and a tin of ground coffee. "From the emergency cache," he said. She looked at him. "How far?" "Half a mile east, buried under stones behind the old post." "You always keep stores out there?" He nodded. "Every fall, in case something keeps me from the cabin." She gave a small, almost smile. "You think ahead." "I've had to." She helped unpack the bundle. Together, they prepared a small stew, and for the first time in days, the cabin smelled of something more than firewood and boiled beans. The scent brought back something faint in Iris, a distant feeling of a kitchen once warm with her mother's broth, and her father coming in from the field with frost on his mustache. She didn't say anything, but the memory caught in her throat. After breakfast, Levi gathered the tools. "Well needs clearing," he said. "If the bucket's frozen, we'll have trouble by nightfall." They walked to the old well in silence. The snow was deeper out here, drifted up to the rim. Levi cleared the top, while Iris chipped at the bucket's frozen chain with a metal pick. The ice cracked, broke free in chunks. Steam rose as they lowered the pail down, then brought it back, clean, cold water sloshing over the side. She watched him as he worked, noticed how his shirt clung at the shoulders, how his hands moved without hesitation. She still didn't know how long he expected her to stay. He hadn't said it aloud, and maybe he didn't know either. But she hadn't asked to leave, and he hadn't given her a reason to. Back at the cabin, she folded her coat and hung it by the stove. He was already sorting nails on the table, laying them out for a hinge repair. She sat beside him, closer than usual, and reached for the hammer. "I can fix the second door. The hinge is loose." He didn't protest. He just passed her the nail. They worked like that for over an hour, neither speaking. Just the sound of metal on wood, the weight of movement, and the steady rhythm of effort shared. When they stopped, she poured water for tea. He leaned back in the chair, eyes on the fire. "You ever think of leaving again?" he asked, voice steady. She set the kettle down. "Before I got here, I didn't think there was anywhere worth staying. And now?" She looked at him, not searching, just sure. "I think I could stay if it was mine to choose." He nodded. "It is." The words settled deep, not as a promise, but as a truth. Later, as the light outside turned gold over the snow, they stepped onto the porch. The sun was low, touching the edge of the ridge. The valley spread silent before them, clean and white and wide. He pointed once, toward a place near the tree-line, almost hidden beneath the drift. "She's buried just beyond there. I'll take you when the ground clears." Iris nodded. "I'd like that." He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect him to. That night, after supper, she cleared the table while he fixed the shelf by the hearth. The second chair had become hers. That much was settled, but she still moved carefully, not out of fear, but respect, for the place, for the man, and for the quiet that had built something between them that neither one had spoken aloud. And when the fire was low and the wind picked up again, just slightly outside, she looked toward the door, then back to Levi. "I never wanted someone to fix things for me," she said. "Just not leave when it got hard." Levi looked at her, and this time, He answered without hesitation. I'm not leaving. She nodded once. Neither of them needed to say what came next. They just stayed. The snow held, crusted over now in the coldest part of the season. It no longer fell, but it also didn't melt, just stayed thick and unmoving across the ground like a second skin. By the end of the second week after the storm, the rhythm between them had shifted from something tentative to something understood. Levi rose before daylight most mornings, stoked the fire, boiled water, and fed the mule. Iris followed without waiting to be asked, handling the firewood, checking the roof edges for drips, patching any wind-chilled gaps in the cabin walls with cloth and wax paper from the trade tins. No one had said the words, but the shape of their days had become joint. That morning, Levi found her sitting by the window with a strip of rough paper in her lap, a charcoal pencil in her hand, the soft scrape of it the only sound in the room besides the crackle of fire. She didn't draw often, hadn't since before the trail, but something about the stillness of the day and the silence they'd built between them brought the need to the surface. She was drawing the mule. When Levi saw it, he didn't say anything. He just stood at the door, arms folded, watching the shape take form. The curve of the back, the wide eyes, the bend of one stubborn ear. The likeness was plain, almost funny. You draw? He asked. Used to. When I had time. You're good. She didn't smile, but she looked up and met his eyes. Thank you. Later that day, he brought down a box she hadn't seen before, kept under the floorboards near the hearth. Not hidden, just out of the way. Inside were old letters, faded cloth scraps, and 2 worn books. One of them was a ledger, the kind used for harvest records or trade. He handed it to her without explanation. She opened it carefully. Inside were columns marked in tight, neat script, crop cycles, seed counts, rainfall notations. But near the back, the tone changed. The handwriting grew looser. Notes that no longer track farm work, but moments instead. Alma laughed during the storm today. Mule got loose again. First cold night without her. Can't sleep. Iris closed the book gently. You write it all down? Only the things I couldn't say out loud. She handed it back. You should keep doing it. Levi looked at her for a long moment, then placed the ledger on the shelf beside the stove. After lunch, they went out together to clear the shed. Not the burned one, the smaller, intact one behind the barn. Inside were rusted hinges, a broken scythe, 2 sacks of grain that had gone half to mold, and a wooden cradle, half assembled and left to dust. She paused at the sight of it, the side rail still unfinished, the wood dry with age. Levi walked past her, picked up a strip of bent metal, and kept going. She didn't ask. But later, as they sat by the fire, she spoke plainly. Was that for a child? He nodded once. She miscarried. 2nd year after we moved here. Iris didn't look away. I lost one too, before the war. Didn't know until it was too late. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was shared. That night, as they prepared supper, Iris set an extra bowl on the table. She didn't know why. Maybe out of habit. Maybe memory. Levi didn't mention it, but he didn't move it either. They left it there while they ate. After they cleaned up, Levi went to the back room and returned with an old tin box she hadn't seen before. He opened it and pulled out a length of twine and a strip of red cloth. I'd like to build something. Not big, just a frame. For the shed wall. Maybe hang some things we used together. She understood the meaning. They weren't splitting chores anymore. They were keeping a place together. She nodded. We'll need hooks. And nails. I've got both. They worked by lantern light. It wasn't about the board or the cloth. It was about the act. Making something new inside the place where so much had ended before. When they finished, they stood in the doorway, looking at it. A row of pegs, a folded cloth hung neatly, a small wooden tray for the needle and twine she used near the fire. It's not much, Levi said. It's honest, she replied. Before turning in, she asked him the question that had lingered since her first night there. Why didn't you ask what happened to me? Why I was on that trail alone? Levi looked at her, his face quiet, unreadable. Because I knew you'd tell me if it mattered. And if it didn't, I didn't want to make you live through it twice. She didn't respond right away, just sat down at the edge of her cot and placed both hands in her lap. I was accused of stealing from one of the wagons. I didn't do it, but the man who made the claim had a name people listened to, and I didn't. She didn't look at him. They said I was bad luck. That I cursed the trail, same as others before me. I've heard it all before. He was quiet, then said, "Do you want to be believed now?" She looked up, eyes steady. "No, I want it to not matter anymore." He nodded. "It doesn't." She didn't cry, but the stillness that followed was heavier than any snowfall they'd weathered so far. That night, as the wind picked up again and the moon slipped behind heavy clouds, Levi added an extra log to the fire without being asked. She laid her blanket over the second cot beside his. No words. They just stayed. The snow finally began to soften by the middle of the third week. Meltwater crept down from the roof in thin trickles, running over the edge of the porch and freezing again at night. The fence posts emerged slowly from the drifts, leaning and bare. Iris stood by the door that morning, wrapped in the coat Levi had given her, watching the way the valley changed color, from dull white to something close to gray-brown, like the land was remembering itself after weeks of silence. Levi stepped outside beside her, a wool scarf pulled close around his neck, one gloved hand carrying a small wooden cross. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't need to. She followed without asking. They walked through thinning snow, boots crunching over ice, past the low fence line and out toward the trees that bordered the southern edge of the land. The air still bit cold, but the light was different, brighter, clearer. The willows by the river stood bare, but upright, their long branches brushing the frozen bank. He stopped beneath one, where the snow had thinned into wet patches of ground. She saw the grave marker before he reached it, a simple stone, half buried, no name visible, just a place set aside, remembered. Levi knelt in the wet soil, brushed the snow from the base of the marker, and replaced the old, worn cross with a new one he'd carved during the last storm. He pressed it firm into the earth, straightened it, then stood again and said nothing. Iris stood beside him, her hands clasped, eyes lowered. "I never held a service," he said quietly. "No one else knew. No preacher, no neighbors. Just me and the ground." "You did right by her," Iris said. He didn't answer, just looked out toward the line of trees, as if checking something that only he could see. "She was young," he said after a moment. "Didn't know how to work the shutters right. I should have been the one up there. She was just trying to help." Iris turned toward him. "There's no blame in what happened." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his face didn't carry weight. It just held stillness. "I know," he said. "I just haven't said it before." They stayed there a while, the silence no longer stiff or restrained, just quiet in the way that honored something. On the way back, they stopped at the shed, the half-burned one they'd left mostly untouched all winter. Levi opened the warped door and stepped inside, the light slanting across the charred beams. Iris followed. Inside, the blackened tools still hung from the wall. The scorched crates still sat in the corners. She ran her hand along a beam, felt the roughness of the fire's memory, the weight of what had once been lost. Levi crouched by a metal frame near the far wall, the remnants of what might have been a beehive stand. "She wanted this to be her work," he said. "I never touched it after. She'd want it used," Iris said, echoing his words from weeks ago. He looked at her, then nodded once. "Then we'll make it something new." That evening, Iris took the ledgers from the shelf and turned to a blank page. She didn't ask permission. She dipped the pen in ink and began recording the supply count, the repair notes, the patches applied to the roof. When Levi saw her writing, he stood by the door for a moment, then crossed the room and set the tin box beside her. "For the rest of it," he said. She opened it. Inside were old receipts, Alma's faded cloth swatches, and a pressed flower, brittle but whole. "Is it all right if I leave it here?" she asked, holding the flower gently. Levi nodded. "It belonged here before you, and I did." She placed it back. Later, over supper, he spoke with a quiet certainty. "I think I'll ride to the fort next week." Iris looked up from her plate. "For supplies? And to let them know I won't be coming in alone next time." He didn't say what that meant outright. He didn't have to. She said nothing, but she reached for the coffee pot and poured him a cup. Her hand was steady. He drank in silence, then added, "I've got an old plow blade rusting in the lean-to. If this melt keeps going, I'll need help setting it." "I can handle a blade," she said. "I know you can." That night, she pulled her cot closer to the hearth. He didn't ask why. She didn't offer a reason. The distance between them had already closed in every way but words. As the fire dimmed and the wind softened across the hills, Levi watched her from the corner of his eye, then quietly set the second chair beside her cot. Not because she needed it, but because she had stayed long enough to deserve every place in that home.